This lecture and interactive discussion is part of Houston Climate Week. My name is Catherine Hayhoe, and I am a climate scientist. I'm delighted to be with you here today to talk specifically about how climate change is affecting the city of Houston and what we expect to happen in the future. So go to pollev.com/Catherine, spelled right, and of course, I'm biased on that spelling, and tell us where you're joining us from. So it looks like we have a lot of people from Texas, not just in the Houston area, but the DFW Metroplex area and in between. We've got a few people from other states as well, which is fantastic. Excellent. Okay, a lot more joining from Texas, good. And you can do this whether you're on Zoom or if you're on Microsoft Teams. It doesn't matter where you're joining us from as long as you are live. Unfortunately, if you are listening to a recording of this, you are not going to be able to participate because this is only for the live event, but you can still see the results of the polling. Okay, that's great. Now, here's your second question. And your second question is this. Second question is, are you in academia, which includes being a student or a teacher? Are you in the private sector? Are you in the public sector? Or are you in the nonprofit sector or other? All right, it looks like private sector came out to a very early lead, but we also have good representation from the public sector, from academia, some from nonprofit, and some from other, which is fantastic. Now, I want to go ahead and start talking about what we're talking about today, which is how is climate change affecting us here in the places where we live? All right, so no matter where we live, we already see weather and climate disasters naturally, right? Here in Texas, we get almost every kind you can imagine. We get tornadoes, hailstorms, winter storms, floods, droughts, hurricanes, severe weather, and more. In fact, according to NOAA, Texas has more billion-dollar weather and climate disasters since 1980 than any other state in the country. The entire US has experienced 273 as of July, so it doesn't include what's happening in August yet, but Texas has had over almost half of those. So if we live in Texas, we're used to weather extremes, like what? Well, we're used to almost anything. In fact, if you think of weather as a pair of dice, where you always have a chance of rolling a double six, well, here in Texas, we already have 3 6s on our dice, don't we? We already have a chance of rolling more extremes than anyone else. Like what? Like hurricanes? Not just today, but all the way back to the Galveston hurricane in 1900. Like floods and droughts, we get both of those here in the Houston area and throughout Texas. We get everything. So whether an event turns into a disaster or not is determined by 3 factors. The factors are exposure, how many people and how much infrastructure and things of value are exposed to the disaster, how vulnerable or how prepared we are, and the event itself. So let me go into this in a bit more detail because what we really care about is disaster, and that is where climate change comes in, but it comes in a larger framework, which starts with exposure. Exposure, again, is the number of people or the amount of infrastructure or things of value that are exposed to a disaster. So, for example, if a hurricane never makes landfall, is it a disaster? Largely no, not unless you happen to be in a ship that gets in the way of the hurricane. But it isn't a disaster for the city of Houston. So exposure matters, and unfortunately, we are very exposed. Our cities here in Texas are growing faster than any other state. The city of Houston continues to build massive and well-functioning infrastructure, which it needs, but the more we build, the more at risk we are. So our exposure is going up, which means our disaster risk is increasing. Then our vulnerability is also increasing. Vulnerability is how prepared we are or how vulnerable we are. Vulnerability can increase for many different reasons. One reason is urbanization. So a study 2 years ago found that not only does urbanization exacerbate the risk of flooding when it rains, so in other words, if it rains in a non-urbanized area versus if it rains in an urban area, it's more likely to flood in the urban area. But in the case of Hurricane Harvey, for example, they found that the fact that that rainfall fell in such a heavily urbanized area increased the likelihood of the massive floods by a factor of 20. So urbanization has a huge role to play in converting weather and climate events into disasters. This is a map you might have seen before. It's based on work by the USGS, and this map itself was created by the Washington Post. This figure shows urbanization across Houston in 2001, and then don't blink, because this figure shows urbanization in 2011. I'll go back and forth between them a couple of times. Look to the suburbs. That's where you see the biggest changes. So our vulnerability due to urbanization is increasing, but that's not the only reason that we're vulnerable. We are also vulnerable if our infrastructure is not maintained. And across the United States, 2 years ago, the American Society of Civil Engineers found that America's infrastructure is desperately in need of investment. In fact, they gave different aspects of our infrastructure a grade. And let me tell you, these grades are not what you would want to see on your child's report card. For example, they gave bridges a C+, dams and drinking water got a D, energy got a D, and hazardous waste a D+, levees got a D, ports got a C+, rail got a B, we don't have much rail compared to some other countries, and roads got a D. This increases our vulnerability because if our infrastructure isn't prepared for what we get, then it's more vulnerable to disaster. That's not all. Our expanding population, our expanding urbanization hasn't just created impervious surfaces, it has also taken away a lot of our protective wetlands, which protect us against storm surges when we have storms. We know that coastal wetlands are very important. So for example, during Superstorm Sandy, which of course hit the East Coast a number of years ago, during Superstorm Sandy, they know that protective wetlands stopped $625 million worth of property damage. So the more we degrade and remove our protective wetlands, the more vulnerable we are. What else? We also know that land is subsiding in the Gulf Coast. And in Houston, according to the USGS's Texas Water Science Center, the main reason for subsidence is because of groundwater withdrawal. And so as the land goes lower down, of course, it increases vulnerability to flooding, especially coastal flooding when seawater comes up during storms. These are all physical sources of vulnerability, but I would be remiss if I didn't end by talking about our social sources of vulnerability. Oh, I'm sorry, before that I forgot, I can show you. Actually, the fact that when you look around the entire United States, sea level rise is greatest in the Gulf Coast area, Houston, as you can see, and Louisiana, because of the subsidence of land. So in other words, global sea level is going up, but if the land is going down, then sea level rise at that location is much higher. Social vulnerability, though, is also really important. We already know that wherever we live, here in the US or around the world, people who are already marginalized, who are already poor, who are already vulnerable, who already have pre-existing health conditions, those people are disproportionately vulnerable to heat waves, to rainfall events and floods, to hurricanes and more. Several studies that have come out just in the past year or two have shown, for example, that African American populations are disproportionately being exposed to extreme heat. When you look across the whole US, including Houston, many of the regions where people of color or marginalized people live are disproportionately already being exposed to extreme heat, to flooding, and other impacts. So their risk of disaster is already higher because of their vulnerability. So our exposure is going up. We already have substantial vulnerabilities, and some of those are going up. And then we have our weather and climate events. This is where climate change comes into it. We know that we're already vulnerable to weather and climate events no matter where we live. We know that. But we also know that climate change is increasing the risk of these events. It's not creating new events that we've never seen before most of the time. It's taking events that we've already had before and it's making them worse. So let me ask you this. When I say climate change in Houston, what's the first word you think of? All right, so this is really cool because you can put in whatever word you want, but if more people say the same word, it shows up bigger. So immediately we can see that more people said hurricane, a few people said Harvey too, more people said flood or flooding, other people have concerned or yes, yeah, yes, I like that. Just a simple yes. Climate change in Houston, yes. Safety, absolutely. Hot, hotter, yep. Oh, and words like unpredictability, danger, yes. Apathy, people thinking it doesn't matter. Carbon, which is causing the problem. Drought, emergency, yes. Opportunity, that too, yep. The bayous, excellent. So why does climate change matter to us? If I asked this question somewhere different, I live in Lubbock, for example, we would see very different words here. So why does climate change matter? It matters because of where we live. And where we live, the vulnerabilities that we have, the exposure we have where we live, interacts with the impacts of a changing climate. To use the metaphor of the dice, we know if we live in Texas, we already have 3 sixes on our dice naturally. We get more weather and climate disasters than any other state in the country. To use the metaphor of the dice, climate change is sneaking in and taking one of those numbers and turning it into a 6 too, or another 6, or even a 7. As the US military calls it, climate change is a threat multiplier. It takes the issues we already care about and we're already worried about, and it makes them worse. We see this reflected in our headlines, like what? Headlines talking about how Houston is experiencing its third 500-year flood event in 3 years. How is that possible? Or the fact that 80% of the high water rescue calls were outside of the floodplain. Or the fact that Houston's breaking the record for the most 100-degree days in a single year. Climate change is loading the dice against us. It's not creating new events we've never seen before, but it's making events stronger, more intense, or more frequent, or sometimes all three. In the news just this week is the fact that this is happening on the other side of the country. In California, they're concerned about wildfires. We haven't seen a change in the overall number of wildfires, but we've seen the area burned by wildfires has doubled as a result of a changing climate. When the wildfire starts, it's much more likely to burn a much greater area today than it was 20, 30, or 50 years ago. That's how climate change is loading the dice against California. How is climate change loading the dice against the Midwest? Well, it's hard to think back a full year and a half now, but if you do, you know that in the Midwest, they experienced record-breaking floods. Climate change is loading the dice against the Midwest by increasing their spring rainfall and their flooding. And of course, back in June, which again probably seems like about a year ago at this point, just back in June, there was a record-breaking heat wave in Siberia that was virtually impossible without the impacts of a changing climate. It increased the risk of this heat wave by several thousand times, scientists have already concluded. So climate change loads the dice against us in ways that matter to the places where we live. And the question that we ask is, how are we going to reduce the risk of disaster? The answer to this question actually lies right here. How do we decrease our risk? We can decrease our exposure. How? By not building in areas that are prone to flooding, by redefining our flood zones, by making people aware of the risks that are posed by the places that they live. How can we decrease our vulnerability? We can decrease our vulnerability by improving where water goes, allowing water to flow through the city and figuring out what to do with it when it arrives. We can decrease our vulnerability by maintaining the integrity of our infrastructure, by making sure that we don't have a lot of cracked pipes and cracked roadways, but making sure that it's all up to date. We can decrease our vulnerability in our social systems by working with people and with neighborhoods and with communities that are marginalized or impoverished to help them prepare for the impacts of a changing climate and build resilience and be aware of the risks that are coming and help them make decisions and invest in their neighborhoods so that they become less vulnerable and more prepared. We can do all of these things, and as a climate scientist, though, I tend to focus on the third one, which is we can look at preparing for the risks that are coming. So how do we prepare for our weather and climate risks? There's 3 steps. Step number 1 is to ask, what concerns do we already have? Because again, climate change affects us depending on the places where we live. So what concerns do we already have? We're concerned about coastal infrastructure at risk of flooding from storm surge and hurricanes. We're concerned about inland infrastructure at risk from flooding during extreme rainfall events. We're concerned about social justice and economic inequalities. We're concerned about aging infrastructure and costly repairs. We're concerned about air pollution and the health impacts of living in our city. We're concerned about ecosystem conservation, such as, for example, ensuring freshwater inflows to Galveston Bay. We make a list of everything we already are concerned about, number 1, and then we look at how these connect to that 3rd category, the climate and weather impacts. How do they connect through heat waves or drought, through heavy rainfall events or more? Then step 3, we say, how are climate and weather risks changing? And this is what the assessment that I contributed to for the city of Houston looks at. What is actually happening? So I want to dig for a few minutes into this assessment and kind of give you an overview of how we looked at that 3rd category. We started by looking at what's already happened in the Houston area. We looked at long-term weather stations around the greater Houston area, and we said, what's already been happening over the last 20, 30, 50 years? And when we looked at these weather stations, we saw that summer is already getting longer. Every season in the year is warming. Extreme temperature is increasing. Extreme precipitation is increasing in many locations. If you've lived in Houston for more than just a few years, you have already experienced changes in climate and weather events in Houston. But we didn't stop there. We also added to that. We looked at what the future holds depending on the choices we make. Will we continue to depend on fossil fuels so our carbon emissions will continue to grow? Or will we transition off fossil fuels to clean energy and also more efficient use of energy such that our carbon emissions peak and then start to go down? The orange line is similar to the path that we as the world are currently on. But the good news is that the green path is most similar to the path that the city of Houston, and the city of Houston is not alone. Many other cities are with the city of Houston, as well as states, universities, tribal nations here in the US and other countries around the world. The green is most similar to the path that the city of Houston is aiming for. So we looked at these 2 different futures. And we translated this global scale information of these 2 different futures into local scale information for the city of Houston using global models and downscaling approaches to these weather stations. And when we did this, this is what we found. We found that for temperature, we would see every season continuing to get warmer. Now, of course, some years are cooler, some years are warmer, that's just weather. But decade by decade by decade, we expect our seasons to continue to warm. We expect summer to continue to get longer, starting earlier in the year and ending later. We expect to see more hot days. We specifically looked at days over 100 degrees. We also expect to see more warm nights. We define warm nights as over 80 degrees at night. And that matters because if it's hot during the day, but you have a chance to cool off at night, that's not nearly as bad, and the impacts on our health aren't nearly as bad as if it just stays hot all the time. We expect that the hottest days each year are getting hotter, and heat waves are also getting longer, as we see, in fact, across the whole US. So specifically, and we have a lot of figures like this in the report, but I'm just going to introduce them to you here. Specifically, for example, we looked at the length of summer. How long is summer? The black line here is the actual observed data from the Houston Hobby Airport. So the black line is what really happened. You can see it starts in 1950 and it goes up to last year. We aren't done this year yet. Then we look at our 2 different futures. The darker orange is our higher future. The lighter orange is our lower future. And you can see that under both futures, we expect summer to continue to get longer, But under the lower future, it kind of plateaus around 125, 130 days per year. Currently, it's about 110 days per year, and that's already changed. It used to be less than 100 days per year back in the 1950s. So from less than 100 days up to about 110 today, up to about 130 under the lower scenario, whereas on the higher scenario, it would get up as much as 175 or 180 days per year. And that's about half the year would be summer. That's a big change. What about days per year over 100 degrees? They're currently relatively rare, as you can see by the black line, but they've gotten a lot more frequent in the last 20 years. In fact, it's not uncommon to even have a week or 2 weeks worth of days over 100 degrees in Houston. And as you can see, we expect these numbers to increase. Under the lower future, they would increase to an average of about 10 days a year. An average, of course, some years would be higher, some years would be lower. But under the higher scenario, they would climb dramatically to as many as almost 2 months worth of days over 100 degrees by the end of the year, which is way too much. So you can see, for example, from this, why the city would be committed to that lower pathway, because there is a huge difference on what we expect in the future for a lot of these extremes, depending on the choices we make, not in the future, but today. Similarly, for warm nights, we see that our number of warm nights have increased a lot in the last 20 or 25 years, and we would expect to see those continue to increase, but there's a big difference between what we expect under a lower or a higher scenario. And again, how do we ensure that we end up on the lower scenario? By making the choices that the city of Houston has made to reduce our carbon emissions, to increase our efficiency, to transition to clean energy, and to limit the amount of change that we see so that we can prepare and adapt. What about precipitation? Precipitation's a bit different. On an annual basis, we haven't seen much of a change historically, and we don't expect to see much of a change in the future. But what we do expect to see is we expect to see more variability. So we expect to see a higher risk of drought in summer, especially as it gets hotter, but we also expect to see increases in heavy precipitation. When we're only looking at rainstorms, not hurricanes, just rainstorms, there isn't that big a change. So for example, you can see that our total precipitation, that's the black line, our observed precipitation, it goes up and down a lot from year to year. It can go between 25 inches in one year to 80 inches in another year. But overall, we don't see a long-term change. Similarly, for heavy precipitation, we do see a lot of variability, and we also see a long-term slow tracking upwards. And you can see the blue shaded areas do get more variable over time. Now, I know what you're probably thinking here. You're thinking, well, you just said rainstorms. What about the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room, given what's happening this week, how we are commemorating Hurricane Harvey from 3 years ago and awaiting the arrival of 2 more named storms this week, the elephant in the room is hurricanes. So we did not specifically look at hurricanes in this assessment. We did not do that because they require very specialized high-resolution modeling. But we can review what other scientists have studied. So first of all, just to make sure you're still paying attention and tracking, this is my last check-in, and then we'll be asking some questions at the end. Where were you 3 years ago this week? Were you evacuating? Were you putting up boards and staying put? Were you watching from afar? Were you completely oblivious? Or why am I even asking this question? Now, if anybody's answering E, let me tell you, I'm asking because this week is commemorating the 3-year anniversary of Hurricane Harvey. So that's why I'm asking. And so it looks like, okay, we have about 17%, 16% were evacuating. And then about similar numbers were putting up the boards and staying put. The majority of us, including me, I was in Lubbock, so that's the opposite end of Texas. The majority of us were watching from afar. And there were a couple of people who were completely oblivious. Yes, hopefully we're not oblivious anymore. All right. So 3 years ago this week, Houston was hit by the most devastating hurricane. Hurricane Harvey smashed all kinds of records: rainfall records, flood records, damage records, and more. How are hurricanes changing? Well, hurricanes are not getting more frequent. I know it sort of might feel like that, especially with the 2017 season and now with 2 hurricanes headed for the Gulf Coast. But long term, hurricanes are not getting more frequent. So does that mean nothing's happening? No, there's a lot happening. First of all, warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along today, there's more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us. And hurricanes are very big storms. So we are seeing the average hurricane have a lot more rainfall associated with it today than it would have 50 or 100 years ago. And a lot of that rainfall is much more intense as well. Hurricanes are intensifying faster because they get their energy from warm ocean water, and the oceans are warming. So their rapid intensification, as meteorologists are looking at just this week with Laura, the new storm that's heading for the coast, rapid intensification is powered by warmer oceans. We also see that even though the number of storms isn't changing, the percentage that are stronger is increasing. So more of the storms we have are stronger, they're moving slower, and they're getting bigger. None of that is good news. And then, of course, there's sea level rise too. Sea level's rising. Why? Because warmer water takes up more space, and because the giant ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, as well as the glaciers too, are melting, and that water is going into the ocean. So we did not analyze hurricanes here, but we do review the scientific literature on them. What does the science tell us about Hurricane Harvey? It tells us a few key things. First of all, the rainfall during Hurricane Harvey was more intense because of a warmer world. Also, the rainfall that fell was about 3 times more likely than it would have been 50 or 100 years ago because of a changing climate. Another study, I'm giving you all the references here because these all come from individual studies. Another study found that climate change increased the risk of this much precipitation happening by about 3 to 3.5 times, so very similar numbers, and that it increased the total amount of rainfall that fell during the whole storm by at least 19%, more likely 38%. So in other words, could you have had Harvey 100 years ago? Yes. Would it have had as much rain? No, it probably would have had about 40% less rain. Another study found that the record high heat in the ocean was a big part of what sustained and intensified Harvey for so long, as well as increasing its flooding on the land. In fact, this study said Harvey could not have produced so much rain without human-induced climate change. And a new study that just came out this past April found that translating all the extra rain into flood damage, at least a third of the economic damages associated with Hurricane Harvey were the direct result of the impact of a changing climate on making that hurricane bigger, stronger, slower, and with a lot more rainfall associated with it, as compared to what it would have looked like if it had come back in 1900, for example, as the Galveston hurricane. And of course, we've got sea level rise on top of this. So we didn't study sea level rise, but there's a great tool called Surging Seas by Climate Central. If you just Google surging seas, it will come right up. And what they're doing here is they're comparing the 2 scenarios we used in our assessment. They're comparing the lower scenario on the right-hand side and the higher scenario on the left-hand side. And you can zoom in to actually see the streets and the neighborhoods here of the areas that would be permanently, this is not temporarily, this is permanently inundated by sea level rise by the end of the century under a higher and a lower scenario. And you can see a radical difference between the left and the right here. And again, this is a big reason why the city of Houston is doing its part to make sure that it does everything it can to make sure that we end up on the right-hand side, not the left-hand side, because it matters to us. And then further studies have even looked, for example, at the economic damages due to climate change, how it would affect our economy. And as you can see, our area, especially across the Gulf Coast, is one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate on our economy. That means our jobs, our industries, our money, our employment, and more. We already know that climate change has dollar economic impacts. not just from Hurricane Harvey, but from flooding and more. I went to a housing conference that talked about how real estate firms are looking at the values of properties and how they're being affected by flooding and by sea level rise. They showed a map that really stunned me because you've got Houston's, the Woodlands, and Sugarland right there at the bottom. They showed a map of the top 50 metro areas and how vulnerable they are to sea level rise. And the green means that they're very vulnerable to just a tiny little bit of sea level rise. Another study that came out last year found that sea level rise is already costing Texas homeowners millions in property values. From 2005 to 2017, homes along the Gulf Coast lost more than $76 million in value due to tidal flooding. So climate change is real and it's already affecting us, but we're already taking action. In Houston, the Buffalo Bayou Project, in Clear Lake, the Exploration Green Project, all of the different water catchment projects and climate adaptation plans that are happening, all of these are positive actions in the right direction to reduce our risk and reduce our vulnerability. People often say, I don't think global warming really matters to me. But today, no matter where we live, we know it does. And in Houston, we see that more than anywhere else. Today, climate change is not an abstract issue. Nearly everybody can point to a way that we're personally witnessing and personally being affected by its impacts. So what is the answer to reduce our risk of disaster? The answer is to build resilience to the risks we cannot avoid by decreasing our vulnerability, increasing our resilience, decreasing our exposure. But at the same time, we also need to reduce our carbon emissions to avoid the impacts that we still have a chance to avoid. And that is why the City of Houston's two-part strategy is so effective. They are reducing emissions and they are preparing to adapt to the changes they cannot avoid. And this is exactly what we need to do to prepare for the impacts of a changing climate. Because climate change is not a distant issue, it is here and it is now. It is affecting every single one of us. No matter where we live, no matter how we vote, climate change matters to all of us, and it just makes sense to minimize the disaster risk to make sure that we are all going to be okay. Thank you. So we have question number 1 already that has 11 votes. Let's see. How much of the climate change impact is associated with community use versus industrial use in Houston? So this is a tough question because there are many different factors that relate to our disaster risk, as I talked about. So first of all, let's talk about global climate change. 75% of global climate change is due to our fossil fuel use. It is due to originally coal and now oil and gas too, digging it up and burning it. Why? Because it produces carbon dioxide, a heat trapping gas. And that heat trapping gas is building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it does not need. And just like you would if somebody snuck into your room at night and put an extra blanket on you, you'd wake up in the middle of the night sweating, saying, who put this blanket on me? In the same way, our planet is running a fever because of this extra blanket. So 75% of that extra blanket is due to our fossil fuel use, and 25% is due to deforestation and agriculture. So that means that to ensure that we go for the lower scenario as opposed to the higher scenario I talked about here, we have to be more efficient with our energy. Did you know that in the United States, we could reduce our carbon emissions 50%? That's 50%, 50, not 15. We could reduce our emissions 50% just through efficiency alone. We'd save money too. But we also need to transition to clean sources of energy that we know so much about here in Texas, where we already get almost 20% of the electricity on the ERCOT grid from clean sources. We have more wind energy than any other state in the country, and we have the potential to supply the entire country with electricity from solar too. In fact, I once calculated we'd only need an area in West Texas, about 100 by 110 square miles or so, covered in old school solar panels to supply the whole country. I wasn't totally sure my calculation was right, but Elon Musk chimed in and said, yes, he'd done the same calculation. He got the same numbers. So we do have to take action, but here's the thing. Remember I talked about how it isn't just about more rain, more flooding, more hurricanes, and more heat. It's about how we are locally vulnerable, right? So if we have areas of the city that have a huge urban heat island effect with no green spaces and trees, as opposed to areas that do, they're more vulnerable. If we have a lot of impervious surfaces with no water drainage, they are more vulnerable. So there is so much that we can do at the local scale to reduce our vulnerability, and we can also do so much at the local scale to reduce our contribution to the global problem too. And that doesn't just impact Houston. Houston serves as an example to other cities through organizations like C40 that sponsored our report, through organizations like the Mayor's Climate Commitment. Cities around the world are taking action, and the fact that Houston is willing to do so will have an impact far beyond the borders of Houston itself. So that was a great question to begin with, and we've got a ton of really good questions coming up. Okay, is there a city that you feel is a good model for their climate change response? Well, first of all, I think that Houston is heading in the absolute right direction. They are covering all aspects of preparedness, vulnerability, mitigation, reducing emissions, looking at industry, looking at neighborhoods, having community discussions. In fact, that's how this assessment started, was with a community discussion. And there's other cities that are a step or two along the way that Houston can look to. So for example, my first city assessment was with the city of Chicago. They're very vulnerable to heat waves, and they have a huge disparity in their marginalized populations and African American populations who live in areas of the city that are more prone to heating. So they actually looked at how they could reduce their urban heat island effect as climate change pushes up their temperatures. Locally, they're able to offset a lot of their local warming by changing and reducing their urban heat island effect. Other cities like New York are out ahead of the curve looking at the impacts of sea level rise and flooding. Cities like London are also looking at that too. Other cities like Los Angeles are very concerned about air quality and air pollution. So there are a number of cities that are already maybe a few steps down the path. But again, what matters is taking that collective information and looking at how it specifically applies to the issues in Houston. Because remember, what was the first step I shared? Step number one is, what are the issues here that we already care about today? Step number two is connect the dots to climate. And then step number three is, how can we better prepare so that we're ready for these as they come? All right. Some of these questions I can't answer, but we are absolutely going to forward them to the city sustainability office. All of these questions are anonymous, but they will be recorded, and they will be able to respond to some of these too. I think it'd be great for them to do maybe a webinar or something where they talk about questions like, is Houston planning on helping people working in jobs for the fossil fuel industry transition to renewable energy jobs? If so, how? I don't know the answer to that myself as a scientist, but I would say as a human being, I hope so, because that's really important. And in fact, a couple of Christmases ago, my husband surprised us with solar panels for our house. And what I was most happy about was he purchased the solar panels from a local company in San Antonio, local in terms of Texas, called Mission Solar, which had previously made headlines for taking in out-of-work oil patch workers who lost their job the last time oil prices plummeted, not this year, but the time before that. It took in out-of-work oil patch workers and retrained them to do solar panel manufacturing. So I love the fact that corporations are already investing in helping people transition to this new energy economy. And I would love to see more of that at every level across our state, because we know energy here in Texas. We have abundant energy, and we have not just the energy of the past, but we have the energy of the future too. All right. More good questions. How do we help Texans in particular, of course, because we're in Texas, change their behaviors and attitudes towards climate change? Yes. So I actually look at this a lot because I live in Lubbock. And in Lubbock, there's a lot of people who say, oh, it doesn't matter to me, or I don't even know if it's real. But when we really start to have a talk about this, we realize it's not the science that people have a problem with, it's two things. Number one is, we don't think that climate change matters to us here and now. We think it matters to people in the future, to people who live far away or to future generations, but not here and not now. The second thing we think is that there aren't good solutions, that the only solutions involve destroying the economy or letting the United Nations take over the world. Or I've even had people say to me, the only solution is abortion. You have to kill all the babies. And, you know, as a Christian, I would say, well, that's not a solution that I'm okay with or comfortable with. So people feel like it doesn't matter and there's nothing we can do to fix it. But of course, the reality is exactly the opposite. It matters here and now. It's affecting us today. And there are many incredible things we can do to fix it right here in Texas that will grow our economy, that will build new jobs, that will invest in the future, that would also clean up our air and our water at the same time, that would help marginalized communities, that would increase our well-being. These are the types of conversations we need to have. If you haven't already, I want to direct you to a resource that I have, and the resource is this. It's my TED Talk. It is called "The Most Important Thing You Can Do About Climate Change is Talk About It." And if you just Google "Hey Ho" and TED Talk, it'll pop right up. The most important thing you can do about climate change is talk about it. Because by talking about it, we can connect the dots between what we already care about, how climate change affects it, and what we can do to fix it. So give my TED Talk a watch if you haven't already, as that will address your question about how do we get people to care. Okay, it looks like we have time for a couple more questions. A lot of people are still hanging in there, so let's run through a few more of these questions. Let's see. Can enough impact be made from personal behavior, or do we need to focus more on lobbying? Well, the answer to that is we need system-wide change. Individually, we don't have the ability, even if every single one of us who cared enough to do so went carbon neutral in our lives, if we could do that. And I don't live somewhere where we have public transportation, and I do have a plug-in car, but it doesn't go forever. So even if we could go 100% carbon neutral, that would not be nearly enough. Even if everybody did everything they could within their own lives, it would only be about 30 to 40% of the solution. We need system-wide change. But here's the thing. Systems are made of people. And that's why having conversations about why it matters to us and what we can do to fix it, and using our voice to advocate for change at every level in our city, holding our city accountable, even if it's doing the right thing, in our school, our university, our organization, our business, our place of work, our institution, our church, our club, our state, our country, advocating for change and talking about what we're doing personally, what other people are doing, what our city is doing, what our organization or business is doing, that is really, really important, because we need change, but we'll only do so if we understand this matters to us here and now, and we can fix it. All right. How is this information being shared with and communicated to state officials and leaders? I think that's a good question for the city to answer. Can I talk about the viability of carbon sequestration? So one approach is to take carbon out of the atmosphere and to put it, for example, in the soil where we want it. And this is a great idea. So tree planting, or managed grazing, or smart carbon farming, like many of our producers do here in our program at Texas Tech. Those are all great ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soil where we want it, because it's an incredible fertilizer. But even if we do the most we can, it still isn't nearly enough. We need more. We have to cut our emissions. We have to cut our emissions. We have to be more efficient with our energy use. We have to look for new sources of energy, and it would be great to take the carbon out of the atmosphere, but don't use that carbon to just inject into oil and gas wells to increase the recovery of oil and gas, because that actually increases our carbon emissions rather than decreasing it. Rather, look at storing carbon in the soil and the biosphere through managed grazing, through regenerative agriculture, through afforestation and reforestation. And if you don't know it already, check out Project Drawdown. It's online at drawdown.org. Project Drawdown is fantastic at explaining all the different solutions to climate change: technological solutions, agricultural solutions, and behavioral solutions. Project Drawdown. Okay. A lot of these questions actually talk specifically about things I cover in my TED Talk. So in terms of having conversations with people, I would encourage you to check out my TED Talk. And there's a lot of great questions about what the city is doing. So I'm going to take these questions, I'm going to pass them on to the city's sustainability office, and they're going to look at a way to respond to these questions and get back to you, because I think it would be great to look at answers to this. So for example, questions about what is Houston doing to reduce public health risk, or to prepare for the double climate risk of extreme weather and divesting from oil and gas, which is a very key question that has to be considered very seriously. How does Houston collect data? How are they impacting the spread of mosquito-borne diseases? The headlines where I live reported that we have West Nile virus here in our city this week. What are the most positive actions for the city of Houston to take? How do we encourage the city to incorporate nature-based flood strategies? These are fantastic questions. And these are exactly the type of questions I'm talking about. These are the questions that we need to be asking, using our voice to advocate for a just transition for people in the oil and gas industry, for nature-based solutions, for marginalized and vulnerable neighborhoods. Ask these questions. Seek answers to these questions from those who can, because by doing so, we will truly head in the direction we all want to head, which is a better world for every single one of us. Thank you for all your incredible questions, which I will pass on to the city, the ones I couldn't answer. Please feel free to check out my TED Talk on how to have those challenging conversations. Also, check out our Global Weirding series. Not global warming, global weirding. It's a YouTube series with short videos that answer common questions, including what does climate change mean for Texas? And of course, this webinar was also recorded. You'll be able to rewatch it later and share it with anyone who is interested. Thank you again so much for joining us. Goodbye.